The coast of Maine sees a lot of schooners. They are as predictable as the rocky shore. One among them is very different. To the untrained eye, she doesn't look different at all, but to those who know her and her story, she stands apart, sometimes very far apart. This is the story of the Schooner Bowdoin, the Arctic exploration vessel captained by Admiral Donald McMillan and others.
The Bowdoin was designed specifically for Admiral McMillan. The small size was important to him for getting her through the ice, finding his way through the leads in the ice and whatnot. Obviously, she had to be ruggedly built. She was built in 1921. He started sailing her essentially right away. And the expeditions from then until the late 30s, anyway, were pretty much focused on scientific work of one sort or another. Scientific work, exploration, things of that sort. It was later in the 30s and then after the war that he started focusing on education more than scientific work.
A 1990 reunion day sail brought several of McMillan's students back together again. When did you sail with McMillan?
Sailed with McMillan in the 48 trip. 3 months out of Booth Bay, and we got as far north as the southern end of the Cane Basin. Okay.
I was on the trip in 1934, and we went down the Labrador coast. As far as I can see, the ship is very much the same. There's some new modern equipment on it, of course. The ship is in beautiful condition, considering its age, going way back to 1921.
What is the history of the Bowdoin from the time McMillan no longer used her?
Well, she went to Mystic Seaport, and they were finding it difficult to keep up with the work on the vessels, and at that time we thought it was a good idea to get the Bowdoin back to Maine, where we felt she belonged. And I think Admiral Mack believed that she should come back to Maine at some time, too. So we got a group together, called it the Schooner Bowdoin Association, and we purchased the Bowdoin from Mystic Seaport for $1. 1968, I think it was, when we brought it up. A lot of very fine philanthropists in the coast, along the coast of Maine, who contributed very generously, allowed us to have various programs, matching funds and this sort of thing. Finally ended up about $1 million restoration program. And we're just delighted to see that it's now with the Academy and that Maine took it over as a state vessel.
She carries the Maine flag everywhere she goes and creates a fair amount of, they call it a goodwill ambassador, if you will.
Thank you, everybody.
In 1991, we departed Castine June 30th. Our first stop was actually unscheduled. We stopped at Sable Island, which is a unique place to visit. We then continued along to St. John's, Newfoundland. We had a brief stop there, and then we're intending to run from there up the Labrador coast to Maine before leaving for Greenland, but 1991 turned out to be the heaviest year for ice on the Labrador show in recorded history. So we instead worked our way up the Newfoundland coast, which was a wonderful surprise to us, to St. Anthony, which is the northernmost peninsula of Newfoundland. In fact, the ice from Labrador extended down south of us at that point. But we worked our way through a fairly open pack out to sea, and from there went to Greenland direct. Our landfall in Greenland was a little south of Gotthog. Every place in Greenland has two names now. There's the Danish name, which was what they used to be known by, and the new Greenlandic names. So our first stop was Gotthog, or Nuuk. A brief visit in Nuuk, and then on to Sukkertoppen. The Greenlandic name for Sukkertoppen is Manitsoq. We continued north, crossing the Arctic Circle, to the village of Jakobshavn, up in Disco Bay, also known as Ilulissat. We went and made a sprint further north to get across the 70th parallel. We made a very brief visit at the next little settlement south of Ilulissat, which is Klaushaven, because they were celebrating their 250th anniversary. And then continued on back down the coast to Nuuk again, where we got ready for the passage back across Davis Strait, and made our landfall then at the northern tip of Labrador at Cape Chidley. And our first harbor there was Bowdoin Harbor. From there, worked our way back down to Nain, on down the coast, passed through what was still left of some pack ice along the coast. It was still remaining in late August. And then on down through the Straits of Belle Isle to Cape Breton Island, through the Bredor Lakes and back down to Castine. The Bowdoin is an extraordinarily capable vessel in rough weather. In the roughest weather that we encountered, which was significant, it wasn't any ultimate storm by any means, but it was 40, 50 knots of breeze perhaps, and as much as 20, 25-foot seas. She is a very comfortable vessel. The people who sleep in the most forward bunks right up in the forepeak might argue with that statement.
This is the forecastle where most of the watch sleeps every 6 hours or so. And as you see, there are, what, 2, 4, 6 bunks down there. And there are 8 more in this room, so you have spaces for 14 to sleep. I remember that when I was on the Bowdoin in '34, that one of these rooms, which now has 4 bunks in it, was a scientific laboratory where Dr. Gross and I skinned all the birds of the expedition, but that no longer is present. And this has been made into a sort of a chart room and map room. There also are several improvements in storage. If you notice, under each of the bunks there are little cubby holes where you can put clothes and supplies. This is a new kitchen, new stove, the sink. This has all been new since I was aboard. And this part I remember very well because this was my bunk. This on the bow, starboard. And, it was quite comfortable. And this is as it was. This is the dining room table. This is where mess was served, and you see this comes up, and the same on the other side, and you can seat 6 people here comfortably, 8 crowded. A watch comes in and a watch goes out every 6 hours, and the cook is constantly cooking.
She's a very handy vessel, a good sailor, also a good motorboat, a good motor sailor as well. She's very rugged, as you can see. She's very sturdy and very comfortable vessel to sail. Interestingly enough, Macmillan had her built in 1921 with watertight bulkheads. That was a concept that was way ahead of its time. His idea then was that, having seen a number of vessels get in serious trouble up north, his hope was that she could collide with a berg or a rock and bust a hole in her bow and still float.
The Bowdoin was in the middle of this fjord with cliffs of perhaps 1,000 feet of solid rock on both sides and not possibility of turning around, too small a space. And Macmillan was at the wheel, and he signaled to the engine room full speed astern, and something mechanically went wrong. Macmillan was cool as a cucumber.
She went right ahead and right up onto the rocks, but the 30-foot tide left us high and dry, gave us a chance to repair the propeller, and then the tide came in, floated us off so we could go off again. No problem at all, and I guess pretty near every trip. I don't know whether the captain does it on purpose, did it on purpose, or whether it was a mistake, but we always seem to go aground at least once on a trip.
He was at that time venturing into places that literally were not charted to speak of. Consequently, McMillan, in that situation, found himself bumping into things quite a lot. This was not through any fault of his navigation, but just because of the hazard of that kind of work. Consequently, most of the stories you hear were from fishermen who hauled him off this rock or hauled him off that rock. By the same token, he had spent enough time along the coasts, particularly along the Labrador coast, that he knew the coast as well as many of the natives folk did. And there's several stories circulating of him actually leading fishermen to safety through bad weather and one kind of peril and another.
Mac was a very quiet person, very authoritative, very sometimes stern, but I would never say he yelled. In fact, I rarely saw him angry.
He was so democratic and just one of us all the way through. There was no great difference. No great differences between crew and skipper.
He let all of us do anything, and you had the feeling as though you were running the ship, but he was watching all the time.
He spent a lot of time at the wheel there, but then we'd spell him. We all took a turn at the wheel, handling the sails, doing the work. My job consisted a lot of going ashore with the dory when we got low on water, and with 10-gallon milk cans, fill them up at some nice freshwater brook. Of course, we caught fish quite a lot. There were times you'd be in the harbor and you'd throw a jig hook over the side and you might bring up 3 codfish all at once.
We were divided up into a starboard watch and a port watch. 6 hours on, 6 hours off, and you rotated between bow watch, crow's nest, and the wheel. And then you had a few hours on call if you were needed.
That old ice box up there, when you're out in the waves and she's going way over and way back, oh, what a feeling. We had to go up there, you know, to see our way through the ice. Looking for a lead through the ice.
Was a time when I was on bow watch, sitting up on the jib sail, which was furled up, and I was cross-stride it. A big storm came up suddenly, and a wave came up over the bow and hit me full on the chest, knocked me off the jib and down this side of the deck, and I came with a torrent of water right back here. McMillan was at the wheel, and he merely reached out and grabbed me by one arm as I came by. Otherwise, I would have been in the ocean. And he often reminded me how he saved my life on the Bowdoin.
The ship was built rugged. The bottom was curved enough and strong enough to fight the ice. Ride up onto an ice pan or crush it or push it aside.
If she were to get, they call it nipped or beset in the ice, the theory is that the shape of her hull would allow her to be pinched out of the ice, popped out of the ice instead of trapped and crushed. A lot of the older vessels that went up there were essentially straight-sided, and they would get actually caught and trapped in the ice and then get crushed.
The reason I first became familiar with the Bowdoin was that my mother, in 1923, when McMillan was frozen in the ice up in Refuge Harbor, North Greenland, she was a young music student in Chicago, and they had a lot of Zenith radio equipment on board the ship, experimenting with long-distance voice transmission. And they had people come in and entertain the crew. And she was asked to sing over the air to McMillan's crew.
He always carried a radio operator from the first time that he installed radio. She is known as having broadcast the first radio signals from the Arctic. They made her as snug as they could get her for that winter. After the ice froze around her and she was firmly locked in, then they used the Inuit technique of building snow houses to basically build the Bowdoin into a snow house. They cut snow blocks, stacked them around the hull, right up to the deck level, So that gave them about a 18 inches thick wall of snow, which of course is a superb insulator, all around the hull. And then on deck, over each of the 3 hatches that gain access to the space down below, they built igloos, and that gave them basically an insulated vestibule or entryway to get in and out of the vessel. His accounts say that she was quite cozy down below. His standards and ours, I think, are probably a little different, but as far as he was concerned, it was fairly comfortable.
We always referred to our trip as an expedition chasing flora and fauna all over the Labrador coast. In other words, some of the professors and students were there to collect birds as much as they could. Some of the students and one of the professors was interested in the flowers and the growth of trees and things of that nature. They brought back pretty 20,000 specimens, I understand.
Most of us, I think, went into science. I became a geologist.
We saw the same wildlife. We made a point of trying to observe some of the same things that he had observed. We had people on board doing bird counts, marine mammal sightings.
Oh yeah, coming right out of the creek. There you go.
We tried to make it a point to visit the same harbors and the same places that we had either heard about or seen pictures of or seen movie footage of in his films. We made a distinct point of visiting Sondrestrom Fjord, which the Bowdoin had surveyed, because Stu Hotchkiss, who had been her skipper during the war, had done the survey of Sondrestrom Fjord, was going to join us for the last leg of our trip. So we wanted to be able to tell him that we'd been there and show him some pictures of it as it was today. Of course, it hadn't changed to speak of.
Here's another one of our Eskimo friends, and he is preparing to roll over in his kayak. Here he goes, and this is quite a trek. He's got cotton in his nose, incidentally. But this is quite a trick, and not everybody can do it. So he was really greatly admired for his ability to do this.
Little right guard, please.
The kayaker that we met put on a demonstration for us. He happened to be the Greenlandic national champion Eskimo roll, which I suppose probably makes him a world champion, I don't know. He put on an incredible show for us, doing things that we never would have imagined possible, including a complete Eskimo roll with a lit cigarette. Never put the cigarette out. In the latter years, Macmillan, after the war, when he started the vessel up again, after he got her back after the war, he carried college students with him to the north in much the same way. He gave them some training in seamanship and some exposure to a lot of the different sciences. On a sailing vessel, you're so much more in touch with everything that affects your day-to-day living and survival that the teaching of seamanship becomes very real. It's right in front of you. The effects of everything you do are very immediate.
I'm cleaning mung.
Mung, show me some mung.
My mung knife. This is mung.
Mung.
It hides out in mung corners.
The principle of mung is neither created nor destroyed. It is merely moved around, you realize. This goes into to make soup stocks for just about everything we eat on board here.
We teach seamanship, we teach traditional sailing. We also teach navigation, but not only is it the academic level of teaching that's going on, but also that which you gain from the personal challenge of going someplace very different, someplace that not very many people go, someplace that has a very harsh environment. Everybody, I think maybe students nowadays, more so than ever before, are craving adventure. It's something that you don't get enough of, I think, in our present day. So there's certainly a measure of adventure there for the sake of adventure. Also, we're looking for a cultural experience, seeing a place that not many people get to see. This is the building called Cratcher's Loft, still standing, in which Peary held his press conference after he returned from the pole. It's described in Macmillan's book and in Peary's book. Meeting some people that not many people get to meet. All of that combined with just the historical side of bringing the Bowdoin back to some people who hadn't seen her in sometimes as much as 50 years, and a vessel that was very dear to them and meant a lot to them. And by bringing her back, we have stirred up a lot of very wonderful memories that were very exciting for us as well as for them.
They all remembered the boat and would come out and give us fish, and were really happy to see us and remember the boat and Macmillan, and it's pretty special.
A gentleman showed up on the vessel because we had sort of sent word out that we were hoping that we might meet more people that knew Macmillan. This gentleman showed up and presented us with a photograph of himself as an infant on his parents' shoulders. This picture had been taken by Macmillan, and the print had been given to the family by Macmillan at a later date, and he had kept it all his life and cherished it, obviously. This moment meant a lot to him, even though he was only an infant when the picture was taken. Later in his life, he had come to know Macmillan when this fellow was a child, and had sold souvenirs to them and whatnot. So they had maintained a sort of a historical connection to the vessel. What we found was a people that are, I think, fairly recently now starting to look back and starting to want to hang on to some of what might have been getting lost there of their culture. We found a very concerted effort at teaching again the old ways, the old skills and the old art forms. So we did get to see a considerable amount of the old culture brought to the present day. The Greenlandic people have just recently taken over their own affairs in home rule. They have just instituted home rule just a few years ago, and I think that perhaps more effort is being made there at establishing their own sense of identity and self. In Labrador, I hear a lot more frustration with the fact that they can't seem to get control of their own affairs. But I think that worldwide there is enough support for that kind of movement that I think that with time it will come, and I hope it will. What's your name?
Trevor.
Trevor?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Trevor Butt.
Trevor Pot?
Trevor Butt.
Butt. All right, Trevor.
Is that a video camera?
What were some of the more memorable events of the '91 voyage?
Climbing up to the glacier in Manitsoq, we spent one whole afternoon climbing much further than any of us had anticipated climbing, but we arrived at the top of the ice cap and spent a night actually in a cabin up there. Beautiful, beautiful experience, extraordinary experience to be sitting up on top of an ice cap like that in the midnight daylight all night long. Beautiful full moon, really a moving experience. The highlight of the trip for, I think, most of us was crossing the Arctic Circle. This was our goal for this trip, was to get the Bowdoin back across the Arctic Circle for the first time since 1954, when Macmillan had taken her up north last. The ceremony of crossing the Arctic Circle involves putting yourselves through a lot of misery with a grin on your face. We stripped down to a minimal bathing suits and whatnot, and stood out on deck in 35-degree weather, being humiliated thoroughly by the only other two official Blue Noses on board, the only other two on board who had been across the Arctic Circle before, having our noses painted blue and then being hosed down by the seawater, which was also about 35 degrees. Fortunately, we all survived that and proceeded to go below to supposedly dine on a feast of all the good things from the Arctic. But unfortunately, our stove had chosen that day to die, so we had a cold dinner instead. The next one was establishing our furthest north and making it up above 70 degrees north latitude. Not only was it an exciting moment to get that far north, but the actual place was so spectacularly beautiful that none of us could have imagined what it was like. I had seen a painting in the home of Ed and Helga Morse. Helga was born in Jakobshavn, actually, and she has a painting in her house of the Disco Bay with all the icebergs floating in it in the midnight sun, and it captivated me. And arriving there, I found myself transported into this scene. It was just extraordinary. If you can imagine a 2 or 3 hour treatment of the most beautiful sunrise-sunset combination, it was spectacular. The peace and the quiet of it up there, the only sounds were the sounds of the vessel and the sounds of icebergs popping around you and cracking. Really an amazing moment. We slipped into a small unnamed fjord there to build our cairn. We anchored. I didn't dare go ashore because there was so much ice around. I was afraid there was a chance that we might get blocked into the fjord, so I wanted to be ready to get underway immediately if it looked like they might close in on us. But much of the rest of the crew went ashore and built our cairn. And when they came back to the boat and we headed out of the fjord, there was the full moon rising again, nearly full anyway. It was indescribably beautiful again.
Probably the northernmost sunrise that none of us will ever see.
The students that came away from that trip, I think, brought with them something that will last a lifetime to them. And I think they will find themselves as attached to the vessel 50 years from now as some of the students that sailed with Mac are 50 years later.
Just another Labrador sunset.
This program was made possible by the support of viewers like you. Thank you.